Greetings, everyone. Shalom. It's so wonderful to be back here at Sacred Waters Retreat Center in Chile and to be back behind my pulpit. I was traveling in the United States for a couple of months, visiting with family and friends, and then in Santiago, Chile for a little while. But after 3 months away, we're finally back and happy to be back in this delicious paradise that God has provided for us. And today I'll continue my sermon series on the Gospel of Thomas. Please go back and watch the previous videos in this series so you can catch up and have the proper context for understanding these sermons, the history of the Gospel of Thomas, and all of that, and why I believe it was a Jewish Christian text or Ebionite text and not a Gnostic text. So today we'll be discussing verse 12, or saying 12. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is to be our leader?" Jesus, or Yeshua, said to them, "Wherever you are to go to James the righteous, or James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." Yeshua makes it very clear. So, of course, Paul was not a leader of the early church. He was never appointed by anyone. He was self-appointed. He was a self-appointed apostle and a false apostle, an apostate of the law, a false prophet, and sort of an antichrist figure. Now, did Paul teach some good stuff? Sure. You know, I love a lot of what Paul taught in his letters. A lot of it's really great stuff, but Muhammad also taught great stuff. Do I think that Muhammad was a legitimate prophet of God? No, I do not. Joseph Smith also taught some good things. Do I believe that Joseph Smith was divinely inspired or a legitimate, authentic prophet of God? I do not. In this ministry, we believe that Yeshua, the Anointed One, was the true prophet, as he is called in the recognitions and homilies, okay, which are sacred Jewish Christian texts, very important text for us in this ministry, okay? And so, especially the homilies, you know, as I learn more about the Clementine literature, I have learned that the homilies really preserve the earliest, most primitive, most authentic version of those teachings and the teachings of Peter, Yeshua's disciple. Peter, of course, was another early leader in the church. All right, he was a very important figure in the church, but he was not the leader. He was not the first bishop of the church. James the Just, or James the Righteous, was. He was Yeshua's brother, blood brother, biological brother, okay? And so James the Just was appointed directly by Yeshua to be the leader of the church, the Jerusalem church. It was not Paul, of course. It was not Peter or anyone else. It was James the Just, James the Righteous, okay? And not only do we know this from what we find here in the Gospel of Thomas, but we also know from Hegesippus, who his writings were preserved by Eusebius, okay, another early church father. Hegesippus was a Jewish Christian, and so he wrote a lot of the history of the Jewish Christian church, or the Jerusalem church, so-called, and we know from him that James was, in fact, the leader. He was the first bishop, and we know not only from that source, but from other sources, that James was a vegetarian and teetotaler. From birth, we're told that he was a vegetarian, okay? And James was killed somewhere between 62 and 67 AD. There are differing accounts, but somewhere in there. And after he died, another brother of Yeshua, Simon, or Simeon, took over leadership, and he lived to be 120 years old. I'm sure due to his healthy diet and lifestyle and regular, you know, ritual immersion in the living waters and fasting and just a righteous life, following the law, the Ten Commandments, and following Yeshua's teachings and all that. Okay? Some people think Simon may have been first cousin, but I think he was Yeshua's brother, based upon some of the research by James Tabor. Okay? By the way, if you don't yet have a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, you can get a copy of my book, Yeshua the Anointed One, Pre-Pauline Christianity. I recently added about 50 pages to this book and republished it. And so I put some addendums at the end and corrected some minor typos and errors and things like that. So it is new and improved. Unfortunately, the price did have to come up a bit because I added 50 more pages, but I think it's $11.77 on Amazon. And in there is the Gospel of Thomas with my commentary. So if you don't yet have a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, it's in that book along with Q, the Epistle of James, and the Didache. Okay? The only other text that I didn't really include in there, although I have a couple little bits and pieces of the Hebrew Gospel, was the Hebrew Gospel and the Clementine literature. The recognitions and homilies are very long. That's why I did not include them in the book. And the Hebrew Gospel, or the Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of the Ebionites, Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, it's all the same text. We just don't have a complete copy of it, just bits and pieces from the early church fathers, what they preserved. And so I do consider that to be an essential Jewish Christian text, but it is not included in my book, okay? But so we know from Hegesippus, by means of Eusebius, okay, that he preserved the history of the Jewish Christian church, or the Jerusalem church, and that James the Just was the first bishop. He was the leader. And he was vegetarian, he was a teetotaler. If you want to know what he taught, simply read the Epistle of James, okay, which is also in my book. And you'll know what James was all about, okay? He taught the same thing that Yeshua taught. He taught the same sort of thing you find in Q, for example, and in the Gospel of Thomas, and in the Hebrew Gospel, and in the Didache, and the Recognitions and Homilies, these other Jewish Christian texts, okay? So he was the founder of that church, more or less. Jesus was the founder, but of course, but James took it over. Shortly thereafter, Simon took it over. And then there's a list that Hegesippus gives of all the bishops of the early church. Now, prior to 70 AD, just prior to the destruction of the temple, the revolt, the war, and all that, these Jewish Christians, so-called, they were just followers of the way, followers of Yeshua, probably called Nazarenes or Nazareans at that time, fled to Pella on the other side of the Jordan River, okay? And they then spread out all over the Transjordan area, up into the towns of the Decapolis, and up into Syria, modern-day Jordan, and even up into Mesopotamia later on, okay? And as that movement spread, they became known as the Ebionites. But they probably started out being known as the Nazarenes or Nazareans. So this verse is extremely important because it proves in a sacred scripture what Hegesippus tells us, that James was the leader of the early church. It's very clear. And this is an early Jewish Christian text, the Gospel of Thomas. It is not a Gnostic text, okay? Now, did Gnostics get a hold of it later and add some interpolations, redactions, and stuff? Probably. But I believe that about 80% of it is very, very early, probably within, the first couple decades after Yeshua's crucifixion is when it was written, alongside Q. It's just part of this common saying source that was written down fairly early on and used by Matthew and Luke, as we know. And at any rate, it's a very early text, and it says it plain as day right here. If you want to know what James was all about, read the Epistle of James and read about the history of James and the early church, okay? But he taught the same thing as Yeshua. He was a very righteous man. He was a vegetarian. He was a teetotaler. And he practiced all the things Yeshua taught. And he taught everything that Yeshua taught, okay? So he was an ideal candidate to be that first bishop of the church, along with Yeshua's other brother, Simon or Simeon. And Paul was not a leader of the early church. He was never appointed by anyone to do anything for any reason at any time. Okay? Peter was a very important leader in the church. I do not believe that he was ever the leader of the Roman church. I'm not sure he ever made it to Rome. Maybe he did. Okay? It's possible. It's possible. Okay, but the Roman church is not the church. So they kind of went back home. If you look at the historical documents that we get from Africanus and Pliny, they talk about this Nazarene area, okay, which was probably in Syria or the Transjordan area, and this, that's where the Nazarenes originally come from. And Epiphanius tells us that they pre-existed Christ, so Christ inherited that tradition. He was the leader of the Nazarenes that, again, come from Damascus, Syria, Transjordan area originally. And so when this group fled, where did they flee? They went back home. They went back to where that group originally came from in the first place, you see. Okay? So I hope you enjoyed this video, and please subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. Thanks so much. Many blessings.